I'm sick and tired of fighting. I'm sick and tired of feeling insecure. It's not easy to feel like I'm in friction with every single contact that I come across. I guess I just thought that when I came here, I'd feel safe. When I came here, people will accept me. When I came here, my family will be free and liberated. But unfortunately, we discovered a new type of oppression.
I remember coming off stage after performing a spoken word piece about the multiple intersecting identities that I hold. I remember adults and educators seeking me out to thank me for being brave, for being courageous, and for sharing my story of resilience. What I don't remember is conversations about how my story connected to theirs in meaningful and critical ways that informed our different histories and supported building a real sense of relation. Later in my adult life, during a spoken word poetry workshop that I was leading, a young person would ask me, "When can I stop being strong?" I didn't have the answer, and that question stayed with me and since then has been the catalyst for me in facilitating the delivery of this film. Young people are often asked to share their stories in performative ways that are palatable for the adults around them. In many ways, we're asking youth to be strong, to be courageous, and to take risks with long-term consequences that we have not prepared them for as they perform their stories of resilience and pain to gain access and favor to spaces and platforms that are predominantly led and defined by adults. As an educator and someone who's worked in community, I've seen the resilience narrative play out far too often, and it can be extremely detrimental to our understanding of youth voice, in our understanding of how to engage youth leadership in authentic, ethical, and respectful ways. The first challenge of the resilience narrative is that it absolves the system of any responsibility for having created the conditions where students and young people need to be resilient in the first place. The structures, policies, and practices that cause them to have to be more resilient go unchallenged and therefore unchanged. The second challenge with the resilience narrative is that youth voice becomes a product to be consumed by educators and people working with young people, rather than an opportunity for deeper reflection or changing our mindsets. When youth voice becomes about consumption, entertainment, or shock value alone, the people working with youth don't have to think about youth or themselves any differently, nor do they have to think or act differently in their relationship to the very contents of that narrative. In conversation with other educators and community partners, we began naming the problematic ways that youth voice is being understood and taken up. These conversations, stemming from concern, ethical considerations, and quite frankly, frustration, are the impetus for this documentary. Throughout the film, we outline 5 myths around youth voice, patterns that we have noticed and that can disrupt how we engage youth voice in our classrooms, in community settings, and in our work with young people. In reality, these myths are interconnected, but for the purpose of clarity, we will explore each one independently. And with that, we hope you enjoy the film and that it both challenges and inspires new possibilities. The challenge with the myth of neutrality is that it underestimates and ignores identities and issues of privilege and power inherent in our systems. This is most evident in our collective inability to disrupt racism, discrimination, and schooling practices. When we buy into the myth of neutrality, we run the risk of passivity and willful ignorance, privileging and supporting the already advantaged while harming those who are underserved and underrepresented due to systemic structures, policies, and practices.
What I think about when I hear the myth of neutrality is the idea that we all come from somewhere. We all have a certain system of beliefs and thoughts, perspectives that we think and write and act from. But the idea of neutrality for me is linked to the idea of power, whose experience, whose knowledge, whose thoughts, and what curriculum, what films, what texts do we read, what are in our schools and what are deemed valuable. Predominantly in schools, at least in the context within which I work, 80% of the teachers, 76 to 80%, are predominantly white women. People who are in positions of leadership in the education system, so we're talking about principals, superintendents, and onward, are predominantly even white male. So we might think we can position and see how that may be a problem, considering that the context within which I work in Toronto, the majority of students come from very diverse backgrounds, both racially, like geopolitically, from different parts of the world, different kinds of generational stories. So I think about who's making the decisions and from what perspectives are they using to incorporate how schooling might look like and how the board might look like. I think one thing connected definitely to the myth of neutrality is an idea of kind of white normative knowledge, right? So the few white men that we read, at least in university or grad school, that form the foundation of really like Western universities are white men, right? So this is an idea, I guess it produces a framework once we think about, especially of course and always in Canada, we should keep the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage very close as we're connected to these histories, but also think about that produces a certain kind of white supremacy, right? So that whiteness is at the top where we think about aesthetics, ethics, culture, literature, art, film, all of these things. There's an underlying, if it goes unmentioned, idea that whiteness is prime, right? We see this is a global kind of knowledge system. We see it in the Caribbean, you see it in the UK, we see it in Canada, and you can see it in the global south, you see it in Australia. So anything that is closest to whiteness is right? So we think about that, and how does that play out for kind of the students that I'm concerned with or that I study and work with, black students. So we think about in Toronto, in the 90s, there's a school board-wide policy that talks about zero tolerance. And zero tolerance policy means at a certain point, any kind of behavior would mean immediate expulsion or suspension and a certain kind of punishment regime that would kick in. So whether we think about the idea of black students or black youth in communities being racially profiled at a higher rate, that doesn't just stop at the door of the school. These things come into the school, and these kind of ideas or knowledge frameworks operate in the school so that black youth become a problem. They become, they're matter out of place. We see how black girls' appearance gets regulated by administrators, whether they're black or white, because white supremacy as a knowledge framework really works through everybody. Break the boundary between kind of like decorum or norm or what the ritualized traditions of a classroom are by producing or asking or creating a space for really searing truth to speak. So by that I mean having students encourage students over I guess a term or over a course to be quite vocal about what it is they want to learn under the heading of the subject, and that I would produce a curriculum that would reflect that. I think about kind of what is critical democratic participation in the classroom, and very often how that exceeds the classroom, where we have to leave the classroom, where we have to think about students' background, students' realities, and we work with that because this is things that they deeply know and intimately care about. So I think about introducing a sense of I would say intimacy or connectivity or relationality into the classroom. That sometimes means we're using language that's not standard English. We might be using what they call quote unquote bad language. But I think allowing for this space, for the classroom to become that space, allows me to understand how to center students in that kind of way. I think also about how we ask so much of students, whether it is in elementary onto the university level where I teach, and we ask so much. We ask them about their background. We ask them to reflect. We ask them to give us papers. We ask them to do all this about them that we kind of in an extractive kind of way, and we never give them anything of ourselves. So we never tell them how we grew up. We never tell them what brought us to teaching. We never tell them about the dreams that we had, that maybe the dreams that got deferred, to use Langston Hughes' term. So I find that I have kind of a radical openness to teaching, where I am a person in the classroom. I am a full human, and I share that with students. I ask them for things, and then I share myself and my story. And I think doing that also gives them license to do the same. One thing that I would also have us think about collectively is moving from kind of really like surface recognition to thinking about an ethic or an idea of relation, which is really thinking about not just acknowledging difference or accounting for difference or just recognizing difference, because very often that could turn into, as they say, saris and samosas and wear your cultural dress for the day. But think about how these histories and these biographies that we bring to this common space of schooling are connected to each other. So that would mean thinking about forging real links between our different histories and identities that would, bear fruit to being able to bear fruit towards investigations, towards explorations that would get us into much more active and knowledgeable and like substantive relations, rather than just recognizing that we're all different in the same way, which is of course not the case. So really putting power and history and our relations with each other together. And in that process, educators cannot be neutral.
Time after time, I've come to recognize that there are dangers lurking on bookshelves. Words and sentences used to affirm the imaginations of boys while leaving girls to wonder if they're good enough to find their prince. And to think that we socialize girls to find their prince charming while never teaching boys how to be charming. I find this alarming. So allow me to tell you some things that these books refuse to. In this life, you had better learn how to take care of yourself. There is no man coming to save you, but one who will always have your back. There's playing princesses in school, but there's no reason to believe that your self-worth will be tied to the views of one who sees you as more destined for the sidelines and being in the game. I don't work this hard for you to not slay. So for every young girl who dreams big dreams, who wants to do things this world has never seen, you go girl, show off your magic, be awesome, make it a habit.
The challenge with the myth of safe spaces is that when we as adults assume and define a space as quote-unquote safe, a young person who continues to feel unsafe to speak up, speak out, or participate may conclude and internalize that they must not be resilient enough because they do not feel secure or comfortable to operate within the parameters of safety defined by the adult. When we remove the assumption of safe spaces, we then create room for important conversations around the legitimacy of young people feeling unsafe and how that relates to their experiences with systemic barriers, rather than insist that they feel safe and be resilient because we say they are.
I think with safe spaces, just the language itself has come to mean that safe spaces is something, it's fixed. And this is what it means for every person in the room. And that oftentimes I, as the adult or the community worker or whoever I might be in the room, I come to define what that means for every person in that room. And then I hold everyone accountable in ways that are meaningful to me. And so I decide what every piece of that looks like. And I think to be able to do the sort of more liberatory work that we want to be doing with youth and alongside youth, for that to happen, we need to be starting at the question of what is safety to you, and to have those conversations as a community. So what we often see is that schools, for example, are not quite organized as communities, and so we don't come to do the work of building that community together. And when we conceptualize these spaces as communities, what we then leave room for is a conversation around In communities, collective care happens. And we share responsibility in this community. We each have roles in this community. We talk about what accountability looks like. So the reality is, in communities, people hurt people, and it very often, I find, is not intentional, but the impact is often still there regardless. So when we come to conceptualize these spaces as communities, what we leave room for is the reality that hurt and harm will happen. And now what we're going to talk about is, how do we do the work of accountability when it does happen? How do we repair relationships when it does happen? How do we stay in the community without sort of quote unquote banishing folks for saying things that are hurtful and harmful, which is also real. One way in which that looks like for us is being able and willing to say, I said this thing, that wasn't grounded in something accurate, or that felt harmful for the following reasons. I need to explore what that means for me. Here's what I'm going to do to repair kind of the relationship here. So being humble enough to kind of point out when we ourselves make mistakes is one of the things that I think can change the entire culture of the community. Because now we've offered a blueprint that says this is what accountability looks like, and also every single person in the space has to be accountable, including me. There's the work of allyship, and then there's self-identifying as an ally. And I think that's the piece that really needs to be problematized, because once we say we are an ally, it's almost like this absolute end of the sentence, the process is done, I am now an ally who essentially will keep you safe. And it's not only a piece around how patronizing that feels, for lack of a better word, to kind of say, I will keep you safe, but also we essentially, I find, need to understand that this is a process, and that community needs to define you as an ally to them, not as something to be self-identified. When I think about the shame and the anxieties, I see them as very similar between adults and kind of youth communities. I find that it's a similar anxiety and stress around having perfect politics, saying the right thing all the time, being kind of the right kind of queer, the right kind of racialized person. And so a lot of these narratives that we see happening for adults, I find that we're seeing them with youth communities. And oftentimes we're seeing with youth, for example, they might not want to engage on a particular topic or in a particular group because they're feeling so much anxiety around not being perfect enough. And so when we think about safe spaces, we actually have to also be redefining it to mean a lot more than what it is. And so does someone feel safe enough to bring their whole selves, to bring their uncomfortable selves, the self that has tensions that they haven't quite worked through, that doesn't have perfect politics, but is working really hard to know better and do better?
The challenge with the myth of youth as passive agents is that there is a miscorrelation between action and resilience in our understanding of young people. We deem certain actions as socially acceptable and in line with the hidden curriculum of what it means to be a quote-unquote good student or model young person. Meanwhile, other acts on the part of young people that may challenge social norms, adult ways of knowing, and authority are interpreted and deemed defiant, disorderly, and worthy of reprimand. Another challenge with this myth is that there is also a miscorrelation in our understanding of passivity and silence. The danger of mistaking silence for passivity or disengagement is that we, as adults, do not recognize or acknowledge that silence on the part of young people can be a form of resilience, and therefore misinterpret and exclude other important dimensions of youth voice.
Ani Bojo, Wasayaban Nidijnakas, Wabshanshi Dodem, Wasaksing and Donjaba, Toronto and Donji and Anishinaabe and Dao. Part of the thing about going to a school is, so for myself, I'd go on a bus and I had to go to this building and I had to go into this class and I had to learn this subject matter, or I had to learn about history lessons that didn't address like my local context. We learned about Canadian geography, but I didn't learn anything about like ceremonial sites like right near the school or Anishinaabeg history. Like it was not local, it was like this broader national narrative. And of course, invisibilized Indigenous people. So I didn't, you don't really feel connected, you don't really feel like you didn't consent to what you're being taught. And even like when I introduce myself and I say, I introduce myself in the language and I say my Anishinaabe name, Wasayaban, I tell you my clan, Wabshanshi or Martin, I tell you my community, Wasaksing, I tell you where I live, that I'm Anishinaabe. Like the reason why those protocols are there is because even when we meet strangers or we introduce ourselves, like that's all the information, that's all built there so that we can start to connect about something, so that you already know my family, where I'm from, why I care about being here, what my responsibilities are. You may not know what Martin Clan is responsible for, but that's something we can talk about, right? So if you come into a place where you both share those things, your relationship's at the core and you're starting to like build that up together. And that is consensual. So it's like I've agreed through that protocol to enter into this relationship. Here's who I am. And then you're asking that educator or someone who has something to share with you to also do that. When like a child is born into Bamadzwe or like their life, they already carry all of the things that they need. We almost can't read the students and what their needs are. Not even what their needs are, but like what gifts they bring into those spaces. Your gift could be anything, really. It could be a powerful voice. It could be the ability, this beautiful memory, so that you can recall things and bring them forward. That might benefit you in a class, but the skills and the things that people are looking for to succeed in that space, it may not always help bring out those gifts in those young people. When I think about the role of young people, I think what really helped me was when a family member shared that it's really important, like in that life stage, that we're really wondering, like we're trying to figure out what is this world, what is my place in it, do I fit in, where do I not fit in, and it was put in the words of also like kind of like wandering. So I think that's it's a really beautiful place to be, and I think and sometimes that's read like that young people don't know how to wonder or wander, or that they need like someone to step up and hold their hand, or someone to tell them, well, here's what you should be wondering or about, and this is what really matters. There's all this like pressure to just figure it out and nail it at a life stage where I don't think that we should be operating from like the opposite. We should be helping people figure out what their gifts are, like wander around a bit, make mistakes, right? Talk to people, get different experiences. There's this real challenge where you learn information, you might learn knowledge, or you might learn like the story about who like that young person is. And it's like, but what do you do with it? So what do you do with that information? How do you take care of it? How does it equip you to be a better educator? It's very much systemic. Like, I don't blame educators. I think they're overburdened, overloaded. There's too many students to put relationship at the center, which I think would benefit not just Anishinaabe students, but everybody. When it comes to, so then what do we do? It really puts the onus on that system. So you do have educators who will try to strive to get to know people. I have seen people really go out of their shell, and I think one of the hardest things for an educator to admit is like just to have that humility that they don't know about Indigenous people. And that's maybe the fear of unknowing, or the fear of not having control over that story or that narrative.
The challenge with the myth that pain has no place in learning spaces is that oftentimes we as adults don't make space for pain because it compromises our own resilience narrative, our own sense of control as the quote-unquote leader in that space, and may touch on unresolved issues and feelings that we have not yet dealt with. What this does is it creates a false narrative that we are resilient adults who have everything together and are strong and can create quote-unquote positive or good classroom spaces by not allowing expressions of pain and emotion to surface. This becomes further complicated when we do invite pain into a learning space. The challenge occurs when the educator's ability to feel the pain of Indigenous, racialized, and marginalized youth becomes a substitute for action. It can create the comforting sense of having done something to help when you actually have not. Youth voice then becomes all about the educator or adult's response to young people's pain for their own use, to help adults work through their unresolved issues and feelings, or for adults to be quote-unquote inspired or motivated by the very pain expressed by young people. Another challenge with this myth is that when youth are invited to share stories of how they experience racism, sexism, classism, transphobia, and other forms of exclusion, it can enlist problematic reactions. One problematic reaction is that, in an attempt to show that we adults are open, empathetic, and vulnerable, we might emote in ways that actually may be experienced as crocodile tears, white fragility, male fragility, classism, colonialism, and heteropatriarchy. This can be very harmful for students because we are building narratives of resilience on the backs and hearts of young people who continue to be marginalized and racialized by system barriers that we are often a part of and complicit in. In this situation, students' pain becomes more about making ourselves feel good or rewarded and diverting our own pain than it is about the young person's ability to use pain as a catalyst for liberation and transformation.
If we focus on just this idea of pain, and I would even extend it and talk about sensation, and talk about the numbness of having to pretend you aren't in pain, or of having to enact a kind of status quo that's being signaled to you very sort of surreptitiously of what you can and can't say. So some pain, certain pain, is allowed in the classroom. But there are others that aren't, and they can be very simple. They don't even have to be so political. Like some of them can be like, what happens when I signal that I'm bored? You know, boredom isn't, I have to somehow stimulate myself. And then there are certain teachers who are really great at working with boredom, but then I can't tell my personal story because they're not therapists or they're not trained for that. First of all, what are you afraid of? What of your own pain are you afraid of? And that's okay to be afraid of it, and that to remind them that we're trained into these behaviors, and that the classroom doesn't have to be a site of retraining. Then I would ask them, do you see the creative potential in all that pain? That when I can feel that I am invited as my whole self, my inner self, my feelings, my beliefs, the things I'm dedicated to, the things I'm afraid of, my hopes, my dreams are rife with my pain. You know, they come from that. My wounds, the things that have happened to me, big or small as they might be, they're related to my gifts, the things I have to give. So what if, or I wouldn't say what if, I'd say, how can that teacher begin to engage or encounter their own pain in the service of the creative potential of the classroom? And I won't even say the students, because it's like the teacher's creative potential, but also how that ripples out to all of the relationships that the students and the teacher will continue to have. The more engaged I am in my whole self, the more ready to learn I am. I don't believe the body can hide its pain. But the imagination can begin to mask the pain. And that then becomes a very, it can be exhausting, but a very, at least, distracting phenomenon where you have to take on the behavior of stillness, numbness, complicity, just even happiness, just to perform and reinvent your emotional state and move it from a place to a place. The thing is that it's unconscious, like it's because we're not engaged with our own emotional depth and our own emotional range, that it can start to, we go into these classrooms and spaces and workplaces that are numb. And then when we get into a place where we're not, it can start to get really delicious. And it can start to feel like something's really happening here. And then it can start to feel like, well, what should we do about this? Or what can we do with this? Or it can seem like the good in it of itself is that pain. Whereas I want to push back a little bit on that, or a lot, and say the emotion in and of itself isn't the good, it's the being, it's how it allows us to relate. And that's why I don't think there's such a difference between like when I feel really good or I feel really bad. It's just the fact of being able to feel. So when I'm working, I'm often asking, okay, listen, don't go to your deepest secrets. You know, understand your own sense of consent and then speak from there. I say this to young people, but also to adults that I'm training. Like, it's not necessary to always to excavate from the depth, to be real. To be real is to share like sensation, you know, and that's why I love the arts, and I love working with the arts in groups, because you get to come to a blank page and feel deep fear, you know, and you get to make that mark and then feel the exaltation. And you don't have to dig into your history necessarily to sense your own resources and the resources that come from your history. It's like to understand my own range, what I'm currently working with, what am I currently processing that I need to do my own creative process with, or do my own therapy around, or ask for my own help, not to give that to my students to hold, or not to do my process by having them do theirs. Their pain is not for me to use. My pain is not for them to hold. But so then you might go the easy route and be like, well, how about no pain at all in the classroom? Why don't we just try to make sure that nobody gets to express their pain? But instead, I want to walk a much more careful path in order to get a much bigger reward, which would be, how can we be here authentically together, but caring for our impact on each other? And helping students to understand that. What I would say to someone who thinks, oh, that's not my problem, is to say, what a lot of work you're doing to imagine yourself out of the world that is constantly begging you to reappear. I think there's a problem of scope sometimes, where we're like, we forget that we're on a planet and spinning around a sun, which is spinning around a black hole in the universe. Like, there's no disconnection that's possible. There's nowhere to go. And except into the imagination. And then to remember how much power we have. And why would we choose numbness and choose sort of a desiccation of this rich, fecund possibility of being alive? Why would we choose this kind of deadness when all around us is the opportunity to come to life?
I learn differently. Oh, you have an IEP? Oh my God, you're so lucky. You get a laptop for free? Must be nice. I wish I was dumb so I can get one too. I learn differently. IEP, Individual Education Plan. I have this because I learn differently. We all have things that we need, like Albert Einstein, who was the smartest person in the world. Even he had a learning disability. He once said, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its abilities to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. We are no different. Because yes, I may learn differently, but that does not make me less intelligent or anyone better than me. Sticks and stones do break my bones, but ask yourself, why do you want to hurt me?
The challenge with the myth of addressing youth voice without addressing adult voice is that the resilience story is not only experienced by young people and students, but also by adults and educators who are silenced in their roles. Adults confront their own realities, assumptions, and biases with the expectation that they can, have to, and always should be resilient. This is especially problematic when Indigenous, racialized, and marginalized educators are not only expected to be resilient despite the systemic barriers working against them, but are also held to unfair expectations of being the model of resiliency for students and young people who share their multiple intersecting identities.
Even if we're going to maintain this like teacher-mentor, student-mentee relationship, what is the basis of that? The ability for the educator to lead by example. In this case, Educators cannot do that because they can't even show that they're drowning. They can't even show their modes of survival. They can't talk about the racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia that they're experiencing in a school setting. They can't talk about that. They have to show the brave face, put on their cloak and walk into their classrooms and leave all of their quote unquote baggage, all of the things that make them who they are, they have to check it at the door. Now we're asking students, we're telling them, no, culturally responsive education, no, bring who you are into the classroom. But the educator can't even do that. So how are we supposed to say, even in a dichotomy where you are the mentor and the mentee, lead by example? You can't lead by example if you're the only Black racialized woman and are really upset that the only support system that exists is you. And so what happens when you get sick, go on mat leave, take a new job, move on? What happens to those students? Who are they left with? Nobody, because you're gone. And the system hasn't created situations where there are multiple avenues for support. There are multiple places that students can go to seek support and help. Part of me wants to say, if you come from a marginalized identity, or you occupy a marginalized identity, and you're in these spaces, wear it loud, wear it proud, be that person. But I know the realities of being that person. I know how violent it can be at times. I know how silencing and lonely it can be at times. And I know what happens when, I've been in that situation where when you're the go-to, and you sometimes position yourself as the go-to because it needs to happen, but it can be super, super alienating. And sometimes you're thinking, am I going too far? Am I pigeonholing myself? Am I that angry black woman in a classroom or in a professional setting? Am I being professional enough? How do I tone police myself to make sure that what my criticisms are being heard as legitimate and true and real, but still taking care of your feelings? I get why some educators will tell me, I don't even want to identify as Muslim. I hide it. I won't tell my students. I won't tell my peers, my colleagues, because it's too challenging. It's too difficult. How am I to support a student who is dealing with the same issues as myself when I haven't fully processed what this means for myself? I see this often of racialized teachers, of marginalized teachers, trying to find space to deal with their trauma, trying to find space to deal with the fact that they might be the only racialized teacher in a school setting, in an educational setting, in a school board, might be the only person that a racialized or marginalized student can go to. I see a lot of educators kind of doing these really not passive, but these silent, small things as a way to give a nod to their students who are challenged with the same thing, but also thinking like, the reality is I need to keep my job. The reality is that I'm a teacher and I love teaching, and I'm limited within the system. So then again, that goes back to the question, what is the system doing to make educators have to make those really tough decisions about what they're teaching in the classroom, what are they presenting to their students as curriculum, how are they positioning questions in their classroom, how are they responding to students who come with them to challenges, do they have the supports to do that? It's a systemic issue. And often the challenges from educators on a teacher level who feel like I'm coming to these workshops and learning, but at an administrative level, I go back to my school and there's a wall, right? And so there needs to be education at all of those levels so that there is an openness to equip the educator, and that they're not just equipped with the tools, but that the structures are also there for them to be able to build something. What kind of employment equity standards are we actually putting into place beyond just putting a little sentence at the end of a job application saying that everybody is welcome here, right? And then once the teachers and educators are here, what helps them stay and feel like, yes, if they have a concern, they're gonna be heard, and it's not gonna be like, it's all in your head, or it's not actually happening, or what kind of systems are in place and what kind of leadership is in place that is bold enough to be able to say, yeah, we do have a problem with race here, we do have a problem with sexism here, or homophobia. We do have assumptions about our educators and our students that are deeply rooted in something else. And so together we have to work through a system. And systemically, I think we need to see our administrators, our educators, our parents, and our students as all part of the solution. Working together, we could all find solutions to make our schools successful and places that feel safe for our families. So I think it's really just shifting how we see leadership, where we're taking knowledge from, and who do we see as the drivers of change.
We can hold space to take the lead in expressing your humanity as an educator. We're not only teaching 1+1 ABCs, but we're teaching students how to navigate the world. So I think that what we need to do as school leaders, as educators, is to not look at a person's age and determine whether or not they are human, and determine whether or not they have emotions and that they have thoughts. A lot of the things that we struggle with as adults happen in schools because we learn those scripts, we learn those social constructs, we learn those ways of knowing. And in our adulthood, we're trying to unlearn a lot of these things. And so I think it's important for us as adults in schools to realize that the same dignity and respect that we would want to have offered to us needs to be in the same way offered to our students, with the same care, the same humility that we would share and treat our colleagues, that even in the position of power, that same humility and care would be exerted towards our students. Trust is earned. It is not something that's a given. And that students need to know that they have the option to trust those who are caring for them. Just because you're the educator in the room or in the school does not mean that you command the trust of the students that you're serving. There is a commitment and demonstration that you can come alongside them and that they can share their stories with you and that you would hold it as sacred. Oftentimes students say things and share things because they think they have to, because they've been silenced for so long that they feel that in order to navigate the schooling system, they have to be complicit with what the teacher says or what the educator says or what the vice principal, the principal says. We are aware that the system creates barriers that our stakeholders have to constantly navigate. Having said that, as the professionals who serve in the roles that we do, we are the system. We are the hands, the feet, the mouth of the system. It's the professional responsibility to find out what we are missing, to uncover the gaps that we may have overlooked, and to turn inward and begin to do things differently and imagine things differently. A lot of times educators think that we're preparing students for the real world without realizing that students are living in the real world. Their life is happening. And so it's important to be able to position the humanity of our students at the forefront of our instruction, the forefront of the schooling experience, because they're living it out in our presence. Ideally, the school would be a hub for the community. There are many centers of gathering. For some communities, the mosque is the hub, the church is the hub. The school can partner in that, in being a hub of a community. We all hold different knowledges that are valued. Our kindergarten students can share their opinions and not be punished. We imagine what leadership looks like from a student's perspective, where it's not necessarily the student who is, receiving the A+ and student council head, or, the one who makes the teacher's life so much easier. But perhaps the leader is the one who's resistant.
I shared that story with a friend, the one about me coming off stage and adults seeking me out to thank me. And my friend said, the next time that you go on stage, ask people not to thank you when you're done, and instead ask them, how has what you've heard affected you or made a difference in how it helps you to relate? When it comes to our experiences with Youth Voice, we must be more intentional in how we access and engage with young people. How does hearing young people's stories equip me to conceive of myself differently? How does hearing these stories equip me to be a better adult, a better educator, or community member? With the humility, accountability, and collective care echoed throughout this film, we can continue our work in building a better, more equitable, and more humane future alongside young people and for future generations.
I am your blood, I am your genes, I am your past, I am your future. I am a human being, and you were once a little child as well. Please do not continue the cycle, and please build a better future for me so that I can build a better future for mine.